Welcome to Reclaiming Me, a trauma informed podcast helping women with complex PTSD heal the lasting impact of childhood attachment wounds from parents and caregivers, so you can finally release people pleasing and perfectionism and learn to trust in relationships, beginning with the one you have with yourself. I'm your host, Cindy Payne, licensed professional counselor, trauma specialist, and someone who has walked this path both personally and professionally. Last week, if you joined us, I shared the heart behind this rebrand, my story, my why, and the vision for this space. Today, we're going to be diving into the foundation of this entire podcast, what complex PTSD actually is. But before we dive in, here are 3 key ideas to hold on to during this episode. Number 1, CPTSD is real, valid, and recognized globally, even if the DSM-5 hasn't caught up. Number 2, your survival patterns are strengths, not flaws. They helped you navigate a difficult childhood. And number 3, healing begins with awareness and language. Once you can name what you've experienced, your nervous system can begin to soften. So take a deep breath and let those settle. For so many women, the hardest part of healing isn't the trauma itself. It's the years spent not having a name for what they're carrying. The hyper-awareness, the guilt, the overthinking, the panic that shows up out of nowhere, the exhaustion from holding everything together. CPTSD often lives in the shadows, not because it's rare, but because it's misunderstood, misdiagnosed, or maybe never named at all. Today, we're going to bring it into the light. I titled this episode, The Trauma That You Were Never Allowed to Name, because for so many people living with complex PTSD, that's exactly what it feels like. CPTSD isn't usually born from one big dramatic event that everyone recognizes as trauma. Rather, it's the slow erosion that happens in environments where fear, instability, or emotional neglect become the air you breathe. And when something becomes your everyday reality, you don't always get the language or the permission to call it what it is. Maybe you grew up in a home where saying "this hurts me" wasn't an option. Maybe the people who caused the harm insisted it was normal, or that you were overreacting. And maybe no one ever validated your experience, and so you learned to invalidate yourself. And so the trauma stays hidden, not because it wasn't real, but because you were taught that naming it was somehow disloyal, disrespectful, dramatic, or just wrong. And that's why I chose this title. Complex PTSD is often the trauma that hides in plain sight. It's 1,000 small wounds that never got acknowledged. It's the pattern that you survived, not the incident. And for so many people, that's the hardest part. It's not healing from the trauma itself, but it's finally recognizing that it was trauma and that you are allowed to name it. CPTSD is one of the most common and least understood trauma responses for women. Not because women experience more trauma, but because women experience more relational trauma. And this is trauma that's rooted in attachment, in caregiving dynamics, in emotional neglect or unpredictability, in being, quote, the easy child, the mature one, the helper, and my personal favorite, the old soul. Most women with CPTSD grow up believing that there is something wrong with them and that everyone else seems to be handling life better than they are. But none of these things are true. You're not broken. You are not weak. Your nervous system adapted to chronic, unpredictable stress. And today we're going to be talking about what that really means. But before we go deeper, I invite you to take a moment, wherever you are, to just land in your body. So begin by softening your shoulders, noticing your breath, and just letting yourself arrive. You don't need to brace right now. You are safe in this moment. You're not alone in this work. So before we get too deep into CPTSD, it really helps to understand the difference between what's often called big T trauma and little t trauma. So, big T trauma is what most people picture when they hear the word trauma. These are events that are immediately overwhelming and life altering. So, things like a serious accident, or a natural disaster, or a physical assault, or military combat. They're the kinds of moments where anyone looking from the outside would say, yes, that was traumatic. But little t trauma, on the other hand, is quieter. It's the kind of trauma that doesn't necessarily look dramatic, but it still impacts your sense of safety and worth over time. So think of things like repeated criticism, or chronic emotional neglect, or constantly walking on eggshells, or growing up in a home where your feelings were dismissed or minimized. And so here's a simple example: big T trauma, being in a serious car accident that leaves you terrified of getting behind the wheel. Little T trauma, growing up with a parent who yelled every time you made a small mistake to the point where your nervous system learned to freeze when someone raises their voice. And here's the key part: little T trauma isn't little in its impact. When those experiences happen over and over, especially in childhood, they stack up. They shape your brain, your beliefs about yourself, and the way that you move through the world. And that's exactly where CPTSD often comes from. It's this long term accumulation of smaller traumas that were never acknowledged, validated, or named. And so let's get into what CPTSD actually is. It's a complex post traumatic stress disorder that forms in environments where trauma was chronic, repeated, relational, and inescapable. Unlike PTSD, which is often tied to a single event, CPTSD forms through ongoing emotional instability, neglect, or fear. It most often happens in our childhood, though it can develop later on in life. But some examples might include having a parent with untreated mental illness, experiencing emotional neglect, unpredictable caregiving, chronic criticism, growing up in survival mode, parentification, which is defined as having to be in a parent role as a child when you are not developmentally ready to do so, substance abuse in the home, domestic violence, divorce or separation with high conflict, being the responsible child, inconsistent affection, conditional love, religious trauma, bullying, and intergenerational trauma. Some of these experiences are loud and dramatic, but many are quiet and often invisible. And the nervous system doesn't distinguish between big trauma and small trauma, only chronic trauma. How does this affect your nervous system? If you grew up without consistent emotional safety, this keeps our nervous system on high alert and a constant state of vigilance. And so this might look like being a monitor of people's tones, body language, mood shifts, periods of silence, micro expressions, and the energy in a room. And this is not weakness, it is survival. And over time, your brain begins to wire itself around one mission. And that mission is to stay safe, stay prepared, and to stay small if needed. And so some of the patterns that emerge from this can look like perfectionism and people pleasing and fawning and hyper independence, emotional numbing, overthinking, blaming yourself, difficulty with relaxing, and emotional flashbacks. For many women, these patterns feel so normal that we don't even realize that they are trauma responses. To understand what complex PTSD actually is, it helps us to look at how it's defined in the ICD. CPTSD includes everything you'd see in PTSD, plus an additional cluster called disturbances in self organization. And so let me break this down because the clusters explain so much of the day to day experience that people have with complex trauma. With PTSD symptoms, there is what we call re experiencing. And this isn't just flashbacks in a dramatic movie sense, but it can be intrusive memories, emotional flashbacks, sudden waves of dread, or just feeling like your body is reacting to something from the past, even when your mind knows that you're safe. Avoidance is another PTSD symptom. Maybe you start organizing your life around not feeling those old feelings. So, avoiding conversations, places, certain tones of voice, or even parts of your own inner world. And again, it's not laziness, it's self protection. Hyperarousal. Think of it as your body staying on guard. Trouble relaxing, difficulty sleeping, or being easily startled, feeling constantly braced for something to go wrong. Your nervous system is operating as if the danger is still present. This is what really sets CPTSD apart from PTSD because it affects who you are, not just what happened to you. Emotional dysregulation. Instead of emotions rising and falling, CPTSD survivors have emotions that often swing hard or go numb. You might feel too much too fast, or maybe nothing at all. And the reaction doesn't always match the situation, it matches your history. A negative self concept. This is deeper than low self esteem. It's the sense that you're fundamentally broken, unworthy, or too much. It often comes from years of being blamed, minimized, or expected to carry emotional burdens that weren't yours to carry. And relational difficulties. CPTSD survivors often talk about how this affects the safety they feel or lack of safety that they feel with people. And this can show up as fawning, avoiding closeness, attaching too quickly, or constantly scanning relationships for signs of abandonment or danger. It's not that you don't want connection, you just never learned what safe connection feels like. And why do these clusters matter? When you put all of this together, it becomes clear why CPTSD impacts so many areas of life: identity, your boundaries, your relationships, your self worth, and even work and decision making. Complex trauma doesn't just change how you remember the past, it changes how you experience yourself in the present. And understanding these clusters can be incredibly validating for people who've spent years thinking, why am I like this? Or what is wrong with me? The answer is nothing is wrong with you. Your nervous system has adapted to chronic stress and harm in the best way it could. Naming these patterns isn't about labeling yourself, it's about understanding yourself. So, before we go any further, I want to pause for a second to talk about something that sounds incredibly dry on the surface, but it is actually one of the biggest behind the scenes forces shaping how mental health care works in the United States: the DSM versus the ICD. So, here's a quick breakdown. The DSM 5, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, is published by the American Psychiatric Association. It's the manual that most clinicians in the United States rely on for mental health diagnosis. It's very detailed, very specific, and very US centric in terms of the structure and the usage. And then there's the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, published by the World Health Organization. This is used worldwide for all kinds of medical diagnoses, both physical and mental. Every country has its own norms, but globally, the ICD is the standard. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Even though the DSM is the cultural superstar in US mental health, insurance companies in the US typically require ICD codes for billing. That dynamic, clinicians diagnosing with DSM and documenting with the ICD, creates this weird dual system reality that almost only exists here. And honestly, this could be a whole separate episode on its own. You could do an entire deep dive into how the US mental health care system is shaped not only by clinical science alone, but by billing structures and insurance demands and the complicated marriage between these two diagnostic systems. I won't go too far down that rabbit hole for today, but just know this. Whenever we're talking about diagnoses in the US, the DSM and the ICD are both in the room, even if only one of them gets talked about. So here's the key point to take away. The ICD recognizes complex post traumatic stress disorder. The DSM 5 does not. But this doesn't mean that CPTSD isn't real. It means that the DSM hasn't updated its categories. Clinical understanding has evolved faster than the manual. Trauma specialists, somatic therapists, EMDR clinicians, and attachment focused providers recognize and treat CPTSD every day. So if you resonate with CPTSD, you are allowed to use that language because your lived experience matters more than a manual. I want to share an excerpt from Stephanie Fu, author of What My Bones Know. She says, complex PTSD isn't about one horrific moment. It's about the small, quiet horrors you carry for so long, you stop realizing they're there. They become part of you, your body, your reflexes, your beliefs, until healing becomes the work of learning what should never have been yours to hold. Oof, take a breath with that. So much of healing CPTSD is unlearning what your body had to do to survive. So, I want to talk a little bit about what CPTSD looks like in your daily life, starting with your attachment and relationship patterns. Picking partners who feel familiar, even if it's unsafe. Wanting closeness, but fearing it. Maybe staying silent to avoid conflict. Difficulty trusting consistency. Over responsibility or over functioning. When it comes to your identity and your self worth, this could touch on chronic guilt, feeling as if you are too much or not enough, feeling like an outsider, collapsing under criticism or feedback. On an emotional level, we can experience emotional flashbacks, shut down or freeze, the need to over explain ourselves, emotional numbness, high sensitivity. And just to clarify something that I've mentioned a few times already on this podcast, fawning. Fawning is a trauma response. It's just like fight, flight, freeze, but instead of running away or shutting down, fawning is when your nervous system tries to stay safe by becoming overly accommodating. And it can look like people pleasing, but to the extreme. So, apologizing for things that aren't your fault, avoiding conflict at all costs, or changing your personality depending on who you're with. At its core, fawning is a survival strategy. It says, if I can keep you happy, then maybe I'll stay safe. A lot of people with complex trauma learned this pattern early on, especially if keeping the peace was the only way to avoid emotional or physical harm. It's not a character flaw. It's a conditioned response from a time when you didn't have any other options. Fawning shows up in a lot of people with complex PTSD because when you grow up in an environment where other people's moods determine your safety, your nervous system learns that appeasing is the safest option. So in adulthood, you might find yourself over explaining or over apologizing or shaping yourself around other people's needs without even realizing you're doing it. It's not you being too nice, it's a trauma pattern that once protected you, even if it exhausts you now. CPTSD can also look like perfectionism, workaholism, avoiding rest, and hyperindependence. Body based symptoms. So, what does your body experience as a complex trauma survivor? Exhaustion, chronic pain, digestive issues, sleep disturbances, and migraines, just to name a few. It's not just anxiety, it's the lived imprint of trauma. When I look back at my own childhood, I can see exactly how some of these patterns took shape. So, for me, for a long time in my family of origin, I played the jester. I was the one cracking jokes, lightening the mood, trying to keep everybody laughing because humor felt like the safest way to manage the tension. If I could make people smile or laugh, maybe the anger wouldn't land on me. Maybe the chaos would stay quiet for just a little longer. But the thing about being the jester is that it only works up until it doesn't. And eventually, no matter how hard I tried to keep things light, I still became the scapegoat, the person who absorbed the blame, the projection, and the frustration, the one who somehow ended up being the problem, even when I was the one trying hardest to make things okay. And after a while, when the humor stopped protecting me, I shifted into something even smaller, people pleasing. I learned to soften myself, to predict what others needed before they said it, to be agreeable, to be convenient. If I could just keep everyone happy, then maybe I'd finally feel safe. These weren't personality quirks, these were survival strategies. First, I tried performing safety. Then, I tried absorbing responsibility. And then, I tried earning it through compliance. So, when I ask you to reflect on your own patterns, I'm doing the same with you. Here are some questions that you can ask yourself. Which roles did you take on to survive? Were you the helper, the peacemaker, the invisible child, the responsible one, the rebel, the clown? And then notice which of these roles still echo in your adult life. No judgment, no shame, just awareness. Because these roles weren't flaws, they were adaptations. And when we recognize them for what they are, we can finally choose something different. So, how do we get support even when there's not a DSM 5 code? Well, now, even though complex PTSD isn't an official diagnosis recognized in the DSM, that doesn't mean that we can't get support. You absolutely can. And instead of focusing on the label, it's about finding the right kind of help. So think about modalities that understand the impact of long term relational trauma. I want to share a few types of support that tend to be especially effective for people dealing with CPTSD like patterns. And the first one would be EMDR. EMDR is a trauma processing approach that helps your brain refile overwhelming experiences so they don't keep hijacking your present. Another form is somatic experiencing, which focuses on how trauma shows up in the body by helping you build safety, grounding, and the capacity in your nervous system. There's internal family systems or parts work, which helps you understand and care for the parts of yourself that developed during trauma instead of fighting with them. Attachment focused therapy, which supports healing the wounds that come from inconsistent, neglectful, or unsafe early relationships. DBT skills, which I talked about in the previous episode, which is great for emotional regulation, distress tolerance, and building stability when your nervous system is easily overwhelmed. Polyvagal informed approaches, which teach you how your nervous system responds to threat and how to gently guide it back towards safety. You don't need a specific diagnosis to explore these. What matters is finding an approach that feels supportive and makes sense for your story. Something else that can be really empowering is simply using language that fits your experience, even if a clinician hasn't given you a code for it. So phrases like, I really resonate with CPTSD symptoms. My nervous system has been shaped by complex trauma. Sometimes that clarity is more helpful than a label because at the end of the day, what matters isn't the letters you were or weren't given, it's the understanding of your patterns, believing your experience, and getting the support that helps you heal. So, I want to do just a brief experiential practice. It's a 2-minute somatic check in. So, if you're in a place where you can find a comfortable seat, just begin to close your eyes if that's comfortable and place a hand on your chest and one hand on your belly. Notice one area that feels more settled. Is it your hands, your feet, your breath? And say quietly to yourself, I am safe in this moment. I can pause. I don't have to do anything right now. Breathe slowly. Return gently when you are ready. So, just some closing insights for today that we covered. Number one, CPTSD is real, valid, and recognized globally. Number two, your patterns are survival strategies. And number three, healing is absolutely possible. With the right tools and support, you can move from survival mode to self reclamation. And in this podcast, we will be taking a deep dive into a lot of these healing modalities. In next week's episode, we're going to dive a little bit deeper into emotional flashbacks, why they happen, what they feel like, and how to recognize and soothe them. These are going to be practical, compassionate tools that you can start using immediately. So thank you for spending this time with me today. I hope you leave feeling a little lighter, a little more grounded, and a little closer to trusting yourself and your relationships. If this episode supported your journey with trauma, attachment wounds, anxiety, or people pleasing, please share it with a friend or follow the show so you don't miss future episodes. For free resources, tools, or to work with me directly, visit cindypayne.com or connect with me on Instagram at cindypaynerooted. This information is also listed in the show notes. I'll be back this Wednesday with a midweek reframe to give you a practical skill, insight, or nervous system tool. and then again next Monday with another full length episode. Remember, every small step toward healing, boundaries, self trust, and presence matters. You are worthy of this journey. Thank you for joining me today. Follow the show so you don't miss future episodes. This is Reclaiming Me. Heal your childhood attachment wounds, release the shame, and reclaim yourself. Thanks, everybody.